Just interrupting today's edition of Counting the Cost. You can see that at al-Jazeera.com if you want to watch the rest of it. To bring you breaking news from Sudan. These protesters in the street in support of President Omar al-Bashir, former President Omar al-Bashir, who we have just learned has been sentenced to 2 years in prison on financial irregularity charges. The background to this, of course, Bashir was 30 years in charge of Sudan. He was removed after the protests in April and since has had charges brought against him on issues of corruption and financial irregularities to the point of apparently having $130 million worth of foreign currency stuffed in suitcases in his own house. Well, the protesters are out, or I should say his supporters are out in the street. Inside the courtroom, we had been watching the judge bring down his verdict a little bit earlier, and Omar al-Bashir himself was in court for that. Hiba Morgan is our correspondent in Khartoum following developments. Hiba, bring us up to date.
Well, Kamal, this verdict has been expected for the past 3 weeks. The judge had already set this date, December 14th, as the date that a verdict will be issued against the former president and his sentencing. Now, there are protests in several parts of the capital, Khartoum, that has been called for by supporters of the former ruling party, which was dissolved 2 weeks ago. They're saying that that what is happening right now, the political transition, the political process that is going on in the country is not something that they support and that they do not favor, they do not want and do not recognize the dissolving of the former ruling party, and that this whole trial is a sham. That is something we've heard from the defense team when they came out just a couple of minutes ago. They're saying that the judge is biased, that the judge has political motivations, that he's leaning towards the Forces of Freedom and Change coalition, and that they do not recognize the verdicts and will appeal. Some of them came out chanting against the judge, chanting in support of the former president, and they say that they will go on to join the protests in the other parts of the capital to show the support and condemn the decision that has been taken, the verdict that has been taken by the judge.
OK, so I feel this is an important point that you've made here, but the fact that Omar al-Bashir does have support. It's easy to cast our minds back to April and to remember the protests which removed him from office, but clearly he still has plenty of support there.
Let's not forget, Kamal, that the guy has been ruling the country for 30 years. So, yes, he does have a certain amount of support in the capital, Khartoum, and various other parts of the country. The turnout so far, if you compare it to the protests that happened in December and that went on to oust him in April and continued after that in a sit-in in front of army headquarters, if you compare the two, it doesn't look like it is as much as the number of people who came out in protest of former President Omar al-Bashir. Nevertheless, there were concerns, and there still remain to be concerns about the people who called for today's protests. The army issued a statement last night and announced that it will be closing roads that is leading to its headquarters here in the capital, Khartoum, and various parts of the country, making sure that there will be no one approaching the army headquarters to try to stage a sit-in similar to the one that happened in April that ousted former President Omar al-Bashir. But that has not stopped his supporters. They're saying that they will continue to protest. Just a few minutes ago, just less than 30 minutes ago, actually, some of them came close to the court before they were dispersed by the police that are guarding the courthouse here ahead of the verdict that was issued just a few minutes ago.
OK, just to clarify, Hiba, before we move on, this 2 years that he gets in jail, what charge is that specifically for? Because there were a few different charges in this first sort of phase.
Well, he has been charged with illicit financial gains, corruption, bribery, and illegal possession of foreign currencies. That is something that the judge, before issuing his verdict, explained what actions come with them if he's found guilty, which he has just been found guilty. But these are not the only charges facing the former president, Kamal. Just a few days ago, he was interrogated on charges of ousting a democratically elected government in 1989. That was the coup that brought former President Omar al-Bashir to power. He's also being charged with inciting and killing of protesters. That charge was directed against him by the prosecutor, by the public prosecutor in May for inciting and killing protesters since the protests began in December. And we're talking at this point of the number of more than 100 people. So even with today's verdict issued by this judge, there are still court cases, there are still legal hearings that we should be expecting in the coming weeks against the former president.
OK, and actually just stay there for me, Hiba, because I want to expand on that a little bit more for our viewers. As Hiba says, the trial's about corruption, illegal possession. There's still more to come, but let's not forget that Omar al-Bashir faces a litany of additional charges. If you go back to 2009, the International Criminal Court charged him with 2 counts of war crimes and 5 counts of crimes against humanity. That was for his role in the war in Darfur, which started back in 2003. 300,000 people died there, another 3 million were displaced. A year later, the same court in The Hague brought 3 counts of genocide. That was also for Darfur. Then in May this year, and that's after he was deposed, of course, Sudan's public prosecutor charged him with inciting and participating in the killing of protesters. Activists say at least 100 people had been killed. And then in November, he and several of his aides were charged for plotting and carrying out the 1989 coup that actually brought him to power. Hiba, just as I read all of those out there, you realise there is so much more against Omar al-Bashir. I guess the prosecutor is going after the things which he knows he can get him on or has a better chance of getting him on now, but there is still a lot of stuff out there.
Yes, indeed, there are still a lot of stuff. And it's not just the western region of Darfur. People, protesters who have toppled him, are saying that there are also war crimes that happened in the southern regions of Blue Nile and South Kordofan. They want to see the former president being held to account for those charges as well. Now, the judge had said that it goes one step at a time, that this is the first charge that has been brought against him, but that in the coming weeks and the coming months, we will be seeing trials and hearings with regards to the other charges, the charges of ousting a democratically elected government in 1989 and the inciting and participating in the killing of protesters. Now, what is not clear is where does the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that happened in the region of Darfur falls. The Attorney General came out and said that this is not his jurisdiction, this is not their jurisdiction, that there is a public prosecutor, and the public prosecutor said that they will try to hold the former president to account for those charges after investigating. But one thing they said is that they're not going to hand him over to the International Criminal Court. That's something victims of the war crimes in Darfur have been calling for the past few months. They're saying that any procession, any legal procession, any trial held here in Sudan is something they will not recognize because they feel that they will not be given the justice they deserve.
OK, Hiba, let's just pause for a second. Looking at pictures on screen now of the Omar al-Bashir supporters in Khartoum, in support of the former Sudanese president, who, if you're just joining us, we have learnt has been sentenced to 2 years in prison on charges of financial irregularity. Yes, 2 years in prison on financial irregularity. This is also including the case of him having suitcases in his house which was stuffed with millions, hundreds of millions in foreign currency. There is plenty of support, as we see, and Hiba was telling us earlier that a man who was in power for 30 years is obviously still going to have a large base of support, and these are the people who are saying they want to challenge what's happened today. Hiba, what about the other side of the coin, the protesters, the ones who brought down the president back in April? Is their voice still loud in Khartoum and in Sudan these days?
Well, they have been calling for justice even before the date of this verdict had been set. They were saying that there are so many crimes that happened throughout the period of 30 years. Now, that is something we have been hearing from them since the beginning of the protest. They've been chanting for freedom, peace, and justice. This is one of their 3 slogans that they came out with, and that they've been saying that if the former president is not held to account, then they would feel that their revolution is incomplete. Now, their focus mostly has been on the protesters who have been killed since the protest began in December. But then people, as I said before, people from Darfur are saying that this is the time. Now, the time has come for the former president to be tried of his crime, especially because the judge said that once the former president was ousted on the 11th of April, any immunity that he had with him has been automatically dropped. So he could be tried for any crime. He was initially sentenced to 10 years in prison. That has been lessened to 2 years because of his age being over 70. But protesters now are going to have to, or rather protesters that came to the streets chanting anti-government protests that eventually led to his ousting, are going to have to wait and see what comes next. They want to know if the legal system here in Sudan will move on after the verdict is issued to try him for the other crimes that they say is the main reason why this country is in turmoil.
Yeah, I'm trying to decide here whether this verdict today will be seen as a victory or not. for the people who ousted Omar al-Bashir. I mean, they want not only him held responsible, but the whole regime and everything that was connected to him responsible. It's a guilty verdict, but it's only 2 years in, and I'm seeing some reports, in a rehabilitation facility possibly.
Yes, it may not go very far in terms of satisfying the people who have taken to the streets for the past few months. Now, let's remember, they have gotten some satisfaction when 2 weeks ago, the Sovereign Council and the Council of Ministers issued a decree dissolving and disbanding the former ruling party and dismantling it and seizing all its assets. They got more satisfaction when just last night, the Sovereign Council issued a decree basically dissolving all the labor unions. Those were unions that were established during the reign of former President Omar al-Bashir and which its members were affiliated to the former ruling party. So to a certain degree, they have gotten some kind of satisfaction or some level of satisfaction, but they have also been calling for justice in terms of what happened in the southern regions of Blue Nile and South Kordofan. They've been calling for justice in the western region of Darfur. So they want to see more steps being taken. For them, this is not enough, and they're concerned that this legal system, the new Attorney General, the new head of judiciary, the new lawyers that have been appointed, may not be enough to counter the lawyers that have been in place for the past 30 years and who were put in place by the former regime. And they say that until they see steps being taken, him being held to account for those crimes, that's when they'll know that they are on the right track.
OK, Hiba, just take a break for now. You're doing a tremendous job for us there, keeping us up to date with what's going on in Khartoum today. I'll just remind viewers who might be just joining us ahead of the news hour at 10:00 hours GMT that the breaking news we've got, the president or the former president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir. Well, actually, let's have a listen to this moment. So some, maybe I won't say chaotic scenes in the court there, but certainly very vocal. Yet to actually find out if those are Bashir supporters or protesters against him. But regardless, the former president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, has been sentenced to 2 years in prison. Well, it was a 10-year sentence. It's reduced to 2 years in some sort of facility, whether it be prison or a correctional facility, for financial irregularities. His supporters are outside. They say that this is unfair, that it's simply going after the old regime, which was ousted back in April, and there is plenty of support out there for Omar al-Bashir. Jonas Horner with us now at the Doha Forum. He is the Deputy Director for the Horn of Africa, Senior Analyst for Sudan at International Crisis Group. Thanks for your time, Jonas. Just as this news is coming through, what's your take on it? The fact that he has been found guilty, yes, but it seems a pretty mild sentencing.
Yes, it is mild. I think all this has required a lot of political soft peddling from the transitional government. The evocative nature of this trial has meant that particularly the civilian government led by Abdullah Hamdok has needed to be very careful about how it's managed this. There's still a lot of NCP support within Sudan, and at the same time, the military retains a lot of NCP supporters. The NCP itself has had bussed in many of its supporters from the countryside into Khartoum for this, in a bit of a show of force, to show that they're not indeed a spent force in Sudan. But yes, the financial crimes version of this of Bashir's trial here is perhaps a way to front load some of the less controversial charges that Bashir faces.
But does it give them a starting point then, a jumping off point for going after the bigger things? Maybe not going right after charges of genocide in Darfur, but escalating the charges to progressively bigger things?
Yes, I mean, first of all, I think the main political moment here is the transition, and the government is taking care of that. The conviction itself will provide some momentum to the transition. It's been needing a win for a long time. It's been somewhat stagnant. The economy has continued to shift on a downward spiral, essentially, and people in the streets really need some evidence of progress for Sudan. So this is essentially soft shoeing things to say, yes, he's convicted 10 years, and then reducing it to 2 has also appeased the remaining NCP groups within government.
Jonas Horner from the International Crisis Group. I'm going to leave you there for now. I hope you'll stick around. We've got the news hour coming up with Nastasia in a moment, and I'm sure we'll want to talk to you further. On our breaking news this hour, that the former president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, has been sentenced to 2 years in jail. This was the moment in court. Consternation in the court there as that sentence was handed down for financial irregularities. The former president of Sudan found with suitcases in his house with foreign currency in them worth up to $130 million. This is after he was deposed by protesters in April. But he's got his supporters, and they are growing in number outside the court. We've been looking at this shot for a little while now, and the numbers have been growing. There is plenty of anger at the decision from the court, remembering that, and Hiba Morgan, our correspondent, told us this, a man who is in power for 30 years, he will have his supporters despite the fact he was ousted by the people on the street.